Hello and welcome to today's session of the NPTEL course Introduction to World Literature. Today we are discussing the text On the Sublime, arguably written by Longinus. The authorship of this work is still debatable. It's a first century text and it has been considered as a text which is now part of literary criticism. Longinus is one of those critics who has laid the foundations of Western critical thought. It would be more appropriate to say that On the Sublime is a text which has laid the foundations of Western critical thought and also has influenced the ways in which the English literary critical tradition has been shaped. So when we talk about English literary criticism, there are three big names which we encounter when we talk about the foundations: Aristotle, Plato, and then it's Longinus. And of course we sometimes also talk about Horace and his Ars Poetica. But these three names, Aristotle, Plato and Longinus, they are extremely important in understanding some of the literary concepts which have worked in very foundational ways to shape the concepts of literary criticism, the concepts of literary yardsticks, and the ways in which we have been taught to read texts in a very traditional, in a very literary critical way. It's important to give a background to our understanding of this text On the Sublime. Before Longinus, there were three major things that were considered as foundational in terms of understanding, in terms of appreciating any literary work. Of course, we know that the works were not published or disseminated in the way that it is in the contemporary. There was an oral tradition, there was a sense of aesthetics, and there was a way in which the forms of art, the forms of entertainment were also read within particular frameworks, were also understood within particular frameworks. And if you know the significance of Aristotle and Plato, you would also know that the understanding of literature was also through rhetoric, through aesthetics, through moral principles. So there was a holistic way in which any kind of art, any kind of artistic output was also seen as. So before Longinus, we are given to understand the function of literature was threefold. One, to instruct; second, to delight; and thirdly, to persuade. So every good work, every work of art, whether it's a play or any poem or something which is part of folklore, the merit of it, the merit of that work, the merit of its effect was judged on account of its power to instruct, to delight, or to persuade. So when Longinus is writing On the Sublime, he is writing from such a context, and we will begin to see how his work On the Sublime also departs significantly from these three aspects: to instruct, to delight, and to persuade. And he begins to talk about this idea of the sublime, and he's the first one to talk about it. And we also know that there are others who perfected this, such as Burke in later centuries. But it's important to realize that the term as such was used, the Greek term of course, was used by Longinus for the first time. And when we talk about sublime, there are multiple ways in which we can situate its meaning today. But in this context, in the context of this text, he is actually talking about how to identify the sublime, or how to, or what constitutes, or what we now understand as sublimity in literature. One of the chief arguments in this text On the Sublime is that the function of literature cannot be limited to these three things, not just to instruct, delight, and to persuade, because these three aspects also require the willing cooperation of the reader. There is a very active, willful participation that one requires from the reader in order to be instructed, or to be delighted, or to be persuaded. Longinus, on the other hand, is talking about the power of the sublime as an involuntary thing, as something which will not merely convince the reader, but will transport the reader out of himself or herself. It's just not really well within the power of the reader. And it's almost like a spell which is cast on the reader. That's the kind of power that Longinus argued that good literature, great literature, should have on the reader's mind. Of course, there are various ways in which one could debate the essentialization which is part of some of the ancient works. But regardless of that, to talk about a new concept, to depart from the ways in which literature and its reading had been seen during that period, that's what makes this text very, very distinct. In this session, we will take a look at some of the excerpts from this dated text On the Sublime, and it's also important for you to keep in mind that 1/3 of this text from the original has been lost. To give you a sense of how this text is structured, to look at the different parts of it, we will also take a quick look at it. And of course, we do have access to the translated version now, and 1/3 of this is said to have been lost. Even when the manuscript was found, it said that they did not have the entire original thing. And incidentally, this is also a text which came into public attention after the 16th century, and only in recent times, especially after the Romantic period, the critics and other writers began to pay more attention to Longinus, and Longinus is also in that sense seen as the first Romantic critic, because he was the one who spoke about the power of their literary work to transport the reader out of oneself, out of himself or herself. So I want to draw your attention to this text, which is also available online. This is addressed to a certain Terentian, as you can see over here, the treatise of Cassius on the Sublime, when, as you remember, my dear Terentian, we examined it together, seemed to us beneath the dignity of the whole subject to fail entirely in seizing the salient points and to offer little profit. It goes on like that. So this is also the tone of this piece, this work on the Sublime. It also gives us an understanding that it's meant to make sense to an educated reader who's also familiar with some of the other things which were written and produced during those times, perhaps. So this is addressing someone, a Terentian, who is familiar with similar kinds of works, and there is a comparative note with which this text begins to talk about the idea of the sublime as well. And what is it that Longinus has in mind when he is put forwarding his arguments? It comes at the end of the first paragraph. In you, dear friend, such is my confidence in your abilities, and such the part which becomes you. I look for a sympathizing and discerning critic of the several parts of my treatise. For that was just a remark of his who pronounced that the points in which we resemble the divine nature are benevolence and love of the truth. So he is looking for a sympathetic and a discerning critic, which also gives us the understanding that this is meant for an educated reader who is also familiar with the current critical traditions. And in the second paragraph itself, we are soon introduced to something which could be considered as a definition of the idea of the sublime. The sublime, wherever it occurs, consists in a certain loftiness and excellence of language, and that it is by this, and this only, that the greatest poets and prose writers have gained eminence and won themselves a lasting place in the temple of fame. So this is the cryptic brief definition that he gives right at the outset for the sublime. It is loftiness and excellence of language. And he also argues at the beginning, he states at the beginning that this is something which would assure a place of permanence as far as literature or artistic works are concerned. A lofty passage does not convince the reason of the reader, but takes him out of himself. And this is the mark of true great literature. It takes one out of oneself. And this, as pointed out, this is not about convincing the reader, not about persuading or instructing the reader. This is having complete authority, complete power over the reader. As we can see as we read on, that which is admirable ever confounds our judgment and eclipses that which is merely reasonable or agreeable. To believe or not is usually in our power, but the sublime, acting with an imperious and irresistible force, sways every reader whether he will or no. So that precisely is the point that Longinus is trying to make, and the crux of the argument throughout this treatise, that whether the reader is willing or not, the sublime has the power to sway the reader this way or not, to sway every reader whether he will or no. And unlike the other three aspects, to instruct, to persuade, and to delight, this is something, this concept of transporting the reader out of himself, out of herself, that is something which happens to the reader in spite of himself, in spite of oneself entirely. Having briefly drawn our attention to what he has in mind, the ways in which he has framed the idea of the sublime, he goes on to tell us whether this is something, whether this is a quality in which someone can be trained or not. Come to the second section. The first question which presents itself for solution is whether there is any art which can teach sublimity, which can teach sublimity or loftiness in writing. For some hold generally that there is a mere delusion in attempting to reduce such subject to technical rules. The sublime, they tell us, is born in a man and not to be acquired by instruction. Genius is the only master who can teach it. The vigorous products of nature, such as their view, are weakened in every respect debased when robbed of their flesh and blood by frigid technicalities. But I maintain that the truth can be shown to stand otherwise in this matter. Let's look at this case in this way. Nature, in her loftier and more passionate modes, while detesting all appearance of restraint, is not wont to show herself utterly wayward and reckless. And though in all cases the vital informing principle is derived from her, yet to determine the right degree and the right moment, and to contribute to the precision of practice and experience, is the peculiar province of scientific method. The great passions, when left to their own blind and rash impulses, without the control of reason, are in the same danger as a ship let drive at random without ballast. Often they need the spur, but sometimes also the curb. The remark of Demosthenes with regard to human life in general, that the greatest of all blessings is to be fortunate, but next to that, and equal in importance, is to be well advised. For good fortune is utterly ruined by absence of good counsel, may be applied to literature if we substitute genius for fortune and art for counsel. So how will it read? So how will that statement read if we substitute literature with fortune? Come back and take a look at it again. For good literature is utterly ruined by the absence of good counsel, good advice. And finally, towards the end of that paragraph, then again, and this is the most important point of all, a writer can only learn from art when he is to abandon himself to the direction of his genius. A writer can only learn from art when he is to abandon himself to the direction of his genius. So, and then he says, these are the considerations which I submit to the unfavorable critic of such useful studies. What's the point that Longinus is trying to make over here? He is departing from the conventional, more dominant traditional opinion about critical genius, about literary genius, that it is inborn. There's nothing which can be added to what is inherently there. And Longinus is trying to argue that, of course, there is nature, there are certain aspects which are there, but unless it is guided well, unless it is advised well with proper counsel, unless it is taken to the right direction with a proper steering, then, to quote his own words, then it would be utterly wayward and reckless. And this is an important point given the time during which this is written, that he is privileging training over genius. And this is extremely important when it comes to the idea of literature, the idea of criticism, that to be able to bring your genius to fruition, a certain kind of a training, a certain kind of a framework within which your genius, your talent is situated, is also extremely important. The first two segments which we took a look at, it has also given you the idea, it has given you a hang of this text, and you can also begin to see that this is not a very difficult text to engage with. I strongly encourage you to read through this on your own and to see how the ideas still resonate even in the contemporary, and how some of the aspects that Longinus talks about, it has really laid the foundation of Western critical thought, and many of the ideas about genius, about literary criticism, about the idea of art, about language, about loftiness of thought, these are some of the things that have drawn much from Longinus' treatise on the Sublime. Today what we shall do is look at some of the important excerpts, and so that you get a hang of this text and you also feel more comfortable in going back to this text and reading through this and looking at the major arguments that it is putting forward. So we come to look at section 5, where he is telling the reader that there are certain glaring mistakes which are part of every work, which are every part of every artistic and literary adventure, and he is trying to tell us how the faults regarding style, the faults in terms of the stylistic representations could be avoided if we keep a few things in mind. And section 6 begins to talk about that, and he also talks about the ways in which some of the ways in which the reader can train himself or herself to distinguish between true and false sublime. And he also tries to kind of give certain frameworks and certain rules to go by so that it's easier to see what it is. In section 7, he's trying to tell us about how great literature can be tested, and this is something that he offers like a litmus test. Of course, there are certain inherent problems with it, the most important problematic thing being this fault of essentialization that Longinus is prone to, as we can see, and he tends to club all kinds of literature in a same way and look at them in a very universal way, which we also see can lead to a lot of complex problems when we try to essentialize, when we try to universalize. So nevertheless, given that this text departs significantly from the prevalent tenets of those times, it's very important to see how he frames his ideas and how the originality of his thought, his critical perceptions come through very clearly throughout this. In section 7, he begins like this: "It is proper to observe that in human life nothing is truly great which is despised by all elevated minds." Here I also want you to think about a certain foundational aspects that Aristotle and Plato also believed in about great minds identifying great literature, and also about the great minds from which great literature is also produced. So here we find Longinus almost following that trail of thought and taking it to a different direction, arguing that if a set of elevated minds, if a set of great minds have decided that a particular text is great, then there is no other way in which it can be judged otherwise. I'll take it to the final section of section 7. "In general, we may regard those works as truly noble and sublime, which always please and please all readers." So this is a phrase which has been used in many contexts, the works which always please and please all readers. And this is something on which Longinus also places most of his arguments, one of his foundational ideas, that there are works which please always and please all readers. And that is certainly a debatable, a contestable thing, of course, but we shall come back to this text. "For when the same book always produces the same impression on all who read it, whatever be the difference in their pursuits, their manner of life, their aspirations, their ages, or their language, such a harmony of opposites gives irresistible authority to their favorable verdict." So this, Longinus argues, is the test of great literature. And coming to section 8, he talks about 5 principal sources from which the sublime originates, on which the idea of the sublime primarily, chiefly rests. I'll read out to you the 5 aspects which he has recorded over here. This is in section 8. The first and most important is 1. Grandeur of thought. The second is a vigorous and spirited treatment of the passions. Third is a certain artifice in the employment of figures. Fourth is dignified expression. Fifth, and the dignified expression is subdivided into proper choice of words and the use of metaphors and other ornaments of diction. Fifth is majesty and elevation of structure. So he also takes the reader through these different 5 aspects and discusses them, and he also chooses to discuss them in detail. In section 9, he draws our attention to the most important one, the most important of these conditions, that being a lofty cast of mind. And this is a faculty rather natural than acquired, he says. Of course, there is genius which can be trained, which can be directed to a better direction, which can be trained well so that it will not go wayward or reckless. But he also believes, like Plato, that there is an inherent natural quality about the loftiness of mind. And he says, I have hinted elsewhere in my writings that sublimity is, so to say, the image of greatness of soul. This is very, very Platonian. And there's an example that he gives for sublimity. It is not always about the words which are there on the page. It's not always about the words which these characters utter. It's also the silence. For instance, the silence of Ajax in the 11th Odyssey is great and grander than anything he could have said. And here he says, this kind of sublimity this elevation is possible because it is coming from a lofty mind. Sublime thoughts belong properly to the loftiest minds. And this is an argument which he pursues throughout this treatise on the sublime, that only a writer, only an author who has lofty thoughts, who has genius, which is well trained and also has lofty thoughts, is capable of producing great literature which will stand the test of time. And he gives a series of examples which we shall not be taking a look at now. Having said that, I want you to recall that this is a 1st or 3rd century Greek fragment which was almost unknown in antiquity. We do not find many discussions or dialogues about this work on the sublime during those times, and this manuscript in fact came to light only by 1554, and this is it's important to know that it's attributed to Longinus, and it could be a generic name, it could be one specific person, it could be a product of a group of people working together on something. There's no way in which we can know this, but there was little critical interest in Longinus on the Sublime until the translation happened to French, from Greek to French. This was in 1674, end of the 17th century. And this acquired wide currency in the literary critical scene of the Western academies mainly. This is in the 16th and 17th centuries. And by the 18th century, the term also gets increasingly detached from its earlier references and meaning, and it's also contrasted with the idea of the beautiful. And this was in fact further developed by Burke and Kant in the later centuries. And I want you to think about how the word sublime is different from the idea of the beautiful. And Burke talks extensively about it. He says something small that we see in nature, like a butterfly or a small flower, it is beautiful. But the kind of feeling that you get when you are standing on top of a cliff and looking down, that is sublime, that is not beautiful. It is something that takes you out of yourself. It transports you out of yourself. And very, very importantly, Burke also says it is an experience which gives you some kind of a fear as well. It is very, very frightening, and it is not something which you experience voluntarily in spite of yourself. When you are standing on top of a cliff and looking up over it, you get this feeling which is sublime, which is frightening, which is not well within your control, but at the same time it makes you it makes you experience the grandeur of it. It is an experience that you would really love to have, but at the same time you realize that there's a certain kind of a fear which you feel along with the beauty that you are experiencing, and that is sublime in Burke's words. So we wrap up today's session by drawing your attention to the fact that there has been a transition from the rhetorical sublime to aesthetical sublime. So having introduced you to Longinus on the Sublime, we come back in the next session to also talk about some of the other aspects which, in connection with Longinus' text on the Sublime, is being discussed in the contemporary. And it's also important to see how the idea of the Sublime has seen as foundational in not just in Western critical thought, but also in shaping the ideas of romantic thought, in shaping the ideas of literary criticism from the 19th century onwards. So with this, we wrap up today's session. We shall be looking at some of the important aspects and also trying to fit this term in the contemporary, in the context of Longinus' dated text on the Sublime. I thank you for listening to this and look forward to seeing you in the next session.